Today's researcher is guest professor here at Malmö University and comes from Department of Political Science at Aarhus University in Denmark. A department that is highly ranked worldwide in the field of political science. He is an associate professor and his research areas includes immigrant integration and integration policies in the Nordic countries and in Northwestern Europe. Please give him a warm hand, Per Mauritsen.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation to do this lecture. It's nice to see so many people here. I hope you like the song by Paul Dissing, which is it's called "Längtan efter Sverige," so longing for Sweden. I thought it was appropriate today. So I'm going to talk to you about Denmark and Sweden. Is there clear blue water between Denmark and Sweden? One of the reasons that I wanted to come here as a guest professor to MIM was that I'm interested in this fantastic contrast between two countries which in almost every respect are really quite similar. Yeah, we have welfare states, we have advanced labor markets, we have highly educated population, and we have more or less the same sort of political values: equality, gender equality in particular, freedom for the individual, and so on. But there's in one respect, we are very, very different, and that's the way we receive and treat immigrants and refugees. Why is that? Why, with so small difference, also so small distance, also geographically between us, with only the bridge to separate us, at least separate Denmark and Skåne? Why is that we are so different? How different are we really? And who is doing best? So, could it be the case that some of these differences in the way that we approach immigrant integration is actually better in one country or the other? Not speaking so much about how this or that immigrant or other private citizen feels about it, but are certain policies working better in Denmark or in Sweden? This is something which is really difficult to say, but there are certain things that we know about it. How come these differences, and what accounts for how can we explain that there are differences both in outcomes but also in the very policies in the first place? Why do we approach this so differently in the two countries? And then I'm going to end with sort of a bit of an encouraging remark, which sort of, in a sense, sort of, spoils it, because, you are in some ways doing better than we are, so you should keep up the good work, I think, but you should also be aware of some dangers, which I'll say just a little bit about towards the end. So, first of all, you could start with some of the mutual stereotypes between the two countries. In Denmark, our image of Sweden is very much depicted in the first picture. The car fires in Stockholm and elsewhere in Europe, everything completely going out of control. Parallel societies where the rule of law is completely suspended and everything is just going down the drain. Over there in Sweden, they don't know what they're doing. It's this multicultural paradise which is turning into hell. I imagine that you, like the Brits, like most of Europe, have another image of Denmark, but which in a sense is equally scary. What we are doing is, telling women who, for various reasons, choose to the full veil, that they should take it off, that it's illegal. So we have the burqa ban in Denmark, as in a few other European countries, and this comes on top on a lot of other very conspicuous policies. We have this new ghetto law, for instance, which means it's actually officially called the ghetto law, which means that in some of these, there's a list of especially vulnerable areas, which is called the ghetto list, also again still officially called the ghetto list, where that's at least the suggestion, and it's probably going to be realized. If you live there and you commit a crime, you'll have double punishment. Or, well, actually, if you do it there, so you don't have to live there, but if you do it there, you'll have double punishment and a host of other things. So mutual stereotypes, but of course also something that's seen from abroad is seen as, many people are looking towards Sweden and Denmark, and in various ways either being encouraged or horrified by what they see. Actually, in this case, with the two examples, you can see both of these are from the front page of The Guardian in Britain. So, they were worried about both countries. Another mutual stereotype example, maybe you know this, this is the Danish version of it. Verdens lykkeligste folk, the most happy people in the world. This was a book by a Swedish author. You can see the irony. I don't have to explain it, but the rural ideal with pigs and roses and a small lamb, not an immigrant in sight, everybody cycling around, and she visits this and she feels the atmosphere. We have another example. This is a Danish public intellectual, Michael Jalving, quite a nice guy, but really completely out there. And he has gone on a mission to Sweden to understand Sweden as an explorer with binoculars and on his moose. And he's also, of course, appalled by what he sees, and he accounts this in this book called Absolute Sweden, Absolute Sverige, Travel into the Kingdom of Silence. Yeah. Okay, so mutual stereotypes. Some of these stereotypes were fed recently in 2015 when we had some 1,600 refugees, many of them passing through Denmark, not all of them, but quite a large amount of them passing through Denmark, walking on the roads, walking also in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. And where were they going? Well, they were going to Sweden. Actually, there were politicians who said, well, why don't they want to stay here? I mean, there was also some of those politicians in favor of restrictions. Why don't they want to stay here? No, they went on to Sweden, where they were met by the polite Swedish policemen just over there at Gilje, a station that I pass every day coming here. And of course, the results of this policy is the result of this stream of this big amount of refugees coming to Sweden, many of whom stay, not all, some are sent back, many of whom stay, and we know this, so the number of refugees has been going up. You can see here a graph showing the development, and this comes on top of a development that goes many years back in Sweden, where Sweden has been one of the most accommodating, both towards immigrants first, but then of course there was an immigrant stop in Sweden like everywhere else, but also towards refugees, so that today there are 17% foreign-born in Sweden compared to 8.5% in Denmark. So when you look at Denmark and Sweden, empirically speaking, Sweden is much more of a multicultural society than Denmark is. Looking at some of the policies, you could pick any of them, but just zooming in on a few, the way that we receive refugees. So you probably can't see this, but if you're interested, you can send me a mail. I can send you the slides. But in terms of asylum law and family reunification law, there are enormous differences. So in Denmark, extremely strict asylum laws. You only get temporary residence, and you've had that system for quite a while, and then it's subject to review, which is quite tough. We don't, at the moment, receive any quota refugees, for the UN refugees. And refugees, importantly, live in secluded camps when they're not allowed to work. In Sweden, you have had historically a very lenient policy, but then, as you know, recently with this post-crisis tightening, so that refugees now, or asylum seekers now, do not, when they are granted refugee status, they don't get a permanent status. They only get a they only get a temporary status. But this is, this may be changed a little bit. But until 2015, they would get permanent residence. If you look at family reunification again, in Sweden, historically, it has been very liberal, only with a small self-support requirement. Then again, some restrictions introduced after 2015. But compared to Denmark, it's absolutely nothing. We have this famous or infamous 24-year rule for spouses, but we also have a 15-year rule for which is less well known, which is about children's integration potential. So if children are too old, they are deemed they've stayed too long in their home country to make them or to integratable in Denmark. And this is sort of completely sort of desk type of officials will not look at whether children of this or that refugee has actually learned Danish and does well in school or whatever. It's simply a question of how old they are and if there is maybe another parent in the country where they come from. So it takes a long time before you can actually have family reunification. 3-year delay, eligibility delay for refugees as it is right now. And in general, you need to have a permanent residence before you can have family reunification, plus another 3 years. And getting a permanent residence in Denmark is much, much more difficult also than it is in Denmark. There are economic self-support requirements which are stiff and so on. So the list goes on and on and on, and the details keep changing. If you look at citizenship acquisition, so naturalization, can you become a Danish citizen or can you become a Swedish citizen? Well, Denmark and Sweden are placed at opposite ends. So this is from a colleague of mine, Sarah Goodman, she looks at sort of 2 dimensions of the restrictiveness of citizenship acquisition, so of how difficult it is. So one of them it's how liberal it is. So how long do you have to be in a country before you can apply for citizenship? Is it possible? Do you have a jus soli system so that you get citizenship if you were born in the country, or is it more a question of blood and who you are born from, who the parent is, and acceptance of dual citizenship? So in Denmark, 9 years residence versus 5 in Sweden. Dual citizenship, we have that, but it was only recently introduced, and the reason it was introduced was to cater for Danes who live in the United States who want to keep their Danish citizenship, and also because it makes it easier to throw people out, because if they have a dual citizenship, you don't get into conflict with the convention on statelessness. Yeah, so people don't become stateless if they are thrown out if they have a dual citizenship. So that sort of cut the ice with the right wing in Denmark. In terms of that's the resident thing and these other things. But in terms of the specific integration requirements that you have in Denmark compared to Sweden, it's also quite stark. Picture in Denmark, you have the very toughest language requirements in all of Europe. You also have a very tough employment requirement. So it's not just that you have to be in employment as when you apply, but you have been in employment uninterrupted in 4.5 years out of 5. And on top of that, you'll have a relatively stiff or relatively difficult citizenship test and loyalty oath and a number of other things. What do you have in Sweden? Well, no substantial requirements. So you can check it if you can go into the website and see what it takes to become a Swedish citizen. And it's really a sort of, an administrative procedure where you send in your passport once certain things apply, and then you can become Swedish citizen. Not so in Denmark. This is just a way to show this for those of you interested. But compared to the rest of Europe, the red. This is some other colleagues who so make this graphical way of depicting the various dimensions of strictness of citizenship acquisition. And Denmark, on various dimensions, is all the way in there with the red dots. Some of them are in the very center, where Sweden is almost filling out this beautiful diamond, and the blue or the whatever violet thing is the European average. And this changes a little bit, of course, from year to year, and this is from 2011. We do a little bit better now on dual citizenship. What's the result of this then, the fact that it's so difficult to become citizen in Denmark? Well, we did, with some colleagues of mine, we did a study based on registry data for refugees who came to Denmark 12 years ago. So people who actually fulfilled the residence requirement. And then we looked using registry data on whether they fulfilled the self-support requirement, so this 4.5 out of 5 years, and whether they had passed this tough level 3 language exam, and also there's this non-criminality requirement. You also have that in Sweden, although it's not so tough as in Denmark. And we found that only about 20.9, so only about a fifth of these were actually able to fulfill the requirement. This does not mean that then they actually got to become citizens, because some of them chose not to apply. And we are looking now, we want to look into why it is that they didn't want to apply, those who were actually eligible. We don't have results from the citizenship test, where you have to read a book and then try to remember the answers for all these questions. We don't have that, but we're going to look at that as well. Compare that to Sweden. Well, where's Sweden? You can't see that, but Sweden is up here. So Sweden have some of you. I mean, you can't. This is a different way of showing it, but the picture is clear. You have the very highest naturalization rates in Sweden in all of Europe. Most immigrants eventually naturalize. It's a natural thing, as it were, to naturalize, to become a citizen in Denmark, in Sweden more so than in any other country. So that's one area where you're different. What about political participation? Well, political participation is linked to citizenship in almost all countries in the world. Although you can have, if you look at elections, or the right at voting, at the right to vote. Of course, you can in most countries you can vote in local elections once you have permanent residency. Again, in Denmark, slightly later than in Sweden, but immigrants can vote after a while in Denmark and in Sweden. The difference then being is that many more Swedish immigrants and refugees get to be citizens and do so much earlier than compared to Denmark. So these stats, which are compiled by my colleague who's sitting over here, Professor Peter Bevelander. So I took these, and if you have detailed questions, I'm sure that he can help you. But if you look at some of the Swedish citizens with a foreign foreign and also a non-Western foreign background, Africa-born, Asia-born, so these are quite high numbers. So 68.3 of those who are Swedish citizens who have an African background. Latin American background, 82.4%. Very, very high percentages. Of course, they are not as high as the Swedish-born Swedish citizens. And they're certainly not as high as those who are not yet Swedish citizens. But then again, remember that it doesn't take so long before you become Swedish citizens. So those who are foreign citizens in Sweden haven't been here for very long. Compare that to Denmark, where we also have stats on local elections. And again, I'm not going to go into all the figures, but you can see here, of course, there's one difference. In Denmark, local elections don't happen at the same time as the parliamentary elections as they do in Sweden. So that makes some difference. But one thing that you can see, I'll just mention one of the things and then proceed, is that the second generation, so children of immigrants in Denmark, have a lower local election participation rate than their parents. And this is and the drop is, I mean, it's not accounted for the fact that more young people don't vote in local elections, and that's accounted for. So in terms of political participation, there's a huge difference between Denmark and Sweden, no matter how you measure it. And of course, the outcome of this is that you have a large you have a large segment of non-citizens, but also non-part of the demos, so the democratic people in Denmark, which are part of the democratic people, the demos in Sweden. And you can see that, I think, in the political, the political life of the country. Not enough research has been done on the effects of this, but I'm sure that the fact that there are so many immigrants who can vote and who have political opinions that they express through their vote, that makes a difference for political life in Sweden compared to Denmark. Labor market integration, so the jewel in the crown of integration, according to many observers. So when many people talk about integration, it's labor market integration. How are we doing there? Well, Sweden is actually doing a little bit better than Denmark. And these stats, they've been compiled by Statistic Denmark. So it's actually Danish economists or whatever they are, who've been doing this. And it shows, the pictures are relatively clear if you look at a number of different types of groups, that after a while, 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, a little bit different between the various groups. After a while, immigrants get a job in Sweden, or higher number of immigrants get a relative number of immigrants get a job in Sweden than in Denmark or Norway. Denmark is at the bottom, then comes Norway for most of these groups, and then comes and Sweden is on top. So there's something there that you do, and what it is, I would really very much like to know, and I don't think we really do know. I mean, we have broadly similar active labor market policies. Historically, maybe a little bit more with the carrot than the stick in Sweden, but I think that's maybe it's not so important. You have lower social benefits in Sweden than we have in Denmark, but they're universal, so everybody gets the same low benefit. Whereas in Denmark, we have this idea of getting the immigrants less money, and also actually people who just finished with their studies now, the so-called start help. It's not much of a help, but it's a start help. There are structural things maybe. I think the Swedish economy is booming, and you also had some earlier structural reforms than compared to us that slowed us down, and we have had a slow post-crisis recovery for a number of reasons. But I mean, these things are very much sort of structurally driven. I think there's agreement about that. You could maybe also look at some differences between groups. Maybe the Turks were somewhat better educated in Denmark. Asylum seekers can work in Sweden. They can't in Denmark. You have subsidized intro wages and so on. But I mean, there's something there that explains there's a difference. If you look then at the softer measures of integration, identification with host country, for instance, this slide here is a little bit difficult to understand. It basically shows that immigrants' identification with host country in Denmark and in Sweden is actually higher than the host population. If you, of course, depending on how you ask, but if you ask, how important is it for you to be Danish or Swedish? How important is that for the person that you consider yourself to be? And this is actually more important for minorities than for majorities, but less important for both majorities and minorities in Sweden than in Denmark. So is that good? Is it sort of less important for you? Is that good? Well, I think it may show something about Swedish nationality, the sense of nationality. That's not really. It's not something that you really go on about. If you look at Norway, it's up here. Yeah. So for them, it's really important. So if you compare to natives, it's higher, and Norway is special there. But then if you look at another type of identification, homeland identification, and these stats are from some new research that we are doing that Peter is also involved in, homeland identification of immigrants. So how much do you identify, how important is your identification with your home country? You have an interesting result here, because it's significantly lower in Sweden than in Denmark. So is that good? Well, I mean, you can discuss that. Is it good to have an identification with the home country? The point is that it's probably an indicator of, as it were, have you left your homeland behind, or the importance of it. And some could say that if immigrants have really identify a lot with their home country, that could really mean that they haven't really sort of, started, whatever they have to start in their new country. What explains these differences? So, is it about Denmark being an ethnic, so German-style type or Eastern European-style country, whereas Sweden is a civic nation? Some colleagues of mine have said that. I think these are two blunt categories, basically, to explain these differences. First of all, because nationhood is conceptualized with civic markers, liberal values and gender equality. And that's what Danes also think is particularly Danish, just as the Swedes will say. But somehow nationhood is still different. I'll just skip these and then try to make a point here that I think you have different types of civic nations. So different types of saying that the nation is something that is constituted by its citizens rather than its cultural heritage. Somehow in Denmark the culture slips in, so you could call it maybe a communitarian cultural civic nation, whereas the Swedish is more sort of a cosmopolitan one. In Denmark, there's an emphasis in public discourse about duties that you have to have and virtues that you have to have in order to earn rights and earn your right to belong, whereas in Sweden you have this very strong language of inclusion through equality of rights. In Denmark we have a strong, so I call it a modern type of nationalism, which is about civic acculturation. So it's about teaching people to become good citizens. This is not something new in the history of nationalism, but it's very strong in Denmark and very much geared to the idea that you have to be the right type of egalitarian, liberal, autonomous citizen to be able to perform in the welfare state of life. It's not as if you don't have this form of life in Sweden, and it's not as if you don't want people to have it. It's just that maybe there's historically a skepticism of this idea of differentiated intervention towards immigrants, that they in particular should somehow learn it. You have a sort of more modernistic context of these ideas. It's more forward-oriented, more international, whereas we emphasize smallness and homogeneity. I think there's also something in the political system where you are you're more sort of top-down. You could say that in a negative way, sort of top-down or technocratic. You're sort of state down. Whereas in Denmark, it's sort of more politicians should listen to the people. It's their duty to whatever they think themselves. Whereas politicians in Sweden will sort of go in front. Optimism in Sweden, pessimism in Denmark. I have to skip a few slides here to make something, to make some points about where does this come from? Why does this happen? Because, I mean, you can say that there are these differences, but where did the differences come from? And there are sort of two different types of explanations here, and this is really for historians, not for political scientists like myself. But some would say, well, this is about the 19th century. It's about Denmark having a very sort of late territorial consolidation. We lost the southern duchesses, Schleswig-Holstein, and we had this anti-German language movement. We had disastrous wars and so on. Well, you didn't really have that at that time. And we had a very sort of romantic nationalism. In Sweden, early state building, territorial integrity, not wars since quite far back, earlier modernization. I don't know. I think there is something to that, but I think the other factor is more important. This is what happened after the World War II. In particular, this long, almost uninterrupted social democratic reign. I think we had social democrats as well, but not quite as strong. And then maybe also the Second World War, Swedish regrets about relations to Nazi Germany. We just managed to be on the right side, as it were. Whereas in Sweden, I mean, you helped there with those trains up there in northern Sweden. You did receive refugees from Denmark, but they had that J for Jew in the passport and so on. So maybe there's this feeling of bad conscience that we really don't have. There's this innocence in Denmark that you don't have in Sweden. Okay, is it all politics? And 2 minutes now. Is it all politics? That's another thing to say, other way to look at it. It's not really about, what happened. It's really about politics. Here you have the same constellation of types of politicians that we have in Denmark, including the bad guy. In Denmark, we had, well, maybe two bad guys. We had both the Danish People's Parties, really the same type of party, only it came a little bit earlier than the Sweden Democrats. And then we had Anders Fogh Rasmussen. The Danish wrote, you could say, well, the Danish People's Party probably more professional, less of a Nazi past, much very skilled politicians compared to the Sweden Democrats. Well, true. But even if the Sweden Democrats aren't very good or are Nazi or whatever, the other parties might just take over their policies. And they, well, you know, sometimes they do if these policies are popular. Somehow they come from something. Unless there's something which holds them back, holds these politicians back from doing that. It didn't hold back this guy. So in 2001, he made this strategic coalition choice to say, okay, in order to have a parliamentary majority for the Liberal Conservatives, we're going to rely on the votes of the Danish People's Party. They'll support our economic policies, and then we'll let them have the dirty bit on citizenship acquisition and integration policies. Why doesn't Ulf Kristersson do that? And this is what Danish commentators say. Hey, why doesn't he do it? Why doesn't he do an Anders Fogh Rasmussen? Well, it could be because he doesn't want to do so, but then there could be another politician who would want to do so. Probably because his own voters would punish him. So there's one big difference. You could say that the Swedish Liberal Conservatives sort of bloc is two-dimensional. So you have cosmopolitans, as it were. You have people who are not so afraid of immigrants. You know, certainly in the Centre Party, but also the Liberal Party, probably also a little bit in the moderates. I mean, it's split in a way that it isn't in Denmark. We don't have as many decent conservatives in Denmark. Or at least they aren't decent enough to say, hey, we're going to defect, we're going to vote for the Social Democrats or some completely other party because of these policies. That doesn't happen. I think there's also this fear, so this creates this fear of defection. This is my analysis, that, you know, particularly if Centre Party is sitting on the fence. So if the decent liberal or conservative voter would swap to the Centre Party if you know things began to get dirty, could the Centre Party then swap side or something else? So there are these dynamics that go against playing the identity policy card in Sweden. That doesn't happen in Denmark. What happens in Denmark is a radicalization effect, so that all the traditional Danish parties, that's including the Social Democrats, they cater for the most radical amongst them. Radical meaning the most sort of skeptical. It's not that all the Social Democrats support these things, but the Social Democrats know that if they get tough, they may lose voters, but they'll lose them to the left wing, and then they can maybe scrape a few voters back from the right. And something of the same is true for the Liberals and the Conservatives. They may lose voters, but they'll stay in the bloc. And that's a big difference. Okay, relative success of Sweden, some clouds looming, violent crime, as in Denmark, with young males, many of them coming at the same time. Trust figures falling, although from a high level. Segregation, cost to the welfare state, although Swedes continue to think that in the long run, ends will meet, or it'll maybe even beneficial. But this will certainly be in the long run. I think to wrap it up, I think you shouldn't go down the Danish way, because although for political reasons or moral reasons, you may want to stop the very liberal refugee policy. That's sort of a separate issue. How many can you accept? How open can the arms be? But in terms of integration policy and citizenship policy, you certainly shouldn't go down the Danish road, because it probably does. I mean, it may be wrong, but it also doesn't help. It doesn't work. The thing that you have to worry about, it's not these, economic problems, or, Sweden will solve these political problems. And the political problem is the deficit of solidarity, because you have traditional social democratic voters, although they don't vote for the social democrats any longer necessarily, traditional social democratic voters who and that's research, quite strong research, Scandinavian research to show this, that if there's a conception that there's a conspicuous group who somehow contribute less, particularly in terms of working and paying tax, either because they're culturally inflexible or have fewer resources or, you know, prejudice about laziness or whatever. If people think that, then they will be less likely to distribute to them, and they will be less likely to distribute at all. So in that sense, there is a bit of a liberal dilemma, so that if you want to have many refugees, you may have less support for the welfare state in the long run, unless you can make labor market integration work. Of course, the good news is then that although you're not brilliant at it, you're better than us. Thanks.
Thank you, Per. Per, take a seat. You will have time to talk a bit more. But now he's eager to get on the stage. Johan Ekstedt, he is PhD student in international migration and ethnic relations. You have about 10-12 minutes.
Very much.
Give him a warm hand.
Thank you. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Thank you very much, Per. This was extremely interesting. It of course opens up many questions. And I'm sure the audience have a few. But before I go into some questions about the topic, I can hear that you are very passionate about this topic. So I'm wondering, how did you get into this topic? How come personally you became interested in this topic? And also, maybe just one word about what do you wish to achieve with your research? What do you want the impact of your research to be?
I came into this research from a completely different academic tradition, which was sort of political philosophy. But that's not so usual, I think, because people who do political philosophy, I suppose, are interested in, you know, more normative concepts about democracy and justice and so on. So going from there towards migration studies in general is not uncommon. What I want to, well, I think we should all. I think all social scientists, but all social scientists certainly should eventually want their research, the results, to somehow have public relevance. There's a Swedish Myrdal, Gunnar Myrdal. He had this idea of value relevance. I don't remember the Swedish word for it. So this is not necessarily that somehow that research tells people or politicians what they should do, because there are normative and political choices also, and certainly in this field that we've been talking about. But it has to have value, or much of it at least should have value relevance, in the sense that it speaks to burning issues in a society at a certain point of time. And I suppose that's sort of my modest ambition, is that at least some of what I do is, you know, if I can somehow manage to get the odd op-ed or you know, public lecture in, that it'll somehow you know, make debates better, which is easier in Sweden than in Denmark.
Okay, that brings me nicely to a second question that I have on a slightly similar topic. The difference between Sweden and Denmark and when it comes to the public debate on migration is very clearly different, perhaps less different since 2015. Some would argue that the Swedish debate has become more similar to the Danish one. But what I would like to ask you is, coming here as a guest researcher, do you find the academic debate to be different also? The Swedish academic debate compared to the Danish academic debate on these issues?
So it's a matter of degrees. In Denmark, in Sweden, there are more, again, with people working with migration and integration issues. There are more people who are, you know, tough multiculturalists, or sort of people who really have very, very strong opinions about you know, multicultural ideals and so on, compared to Denmark. So it's a matter of degree, but
right,
but there are more. I mean, and slightly smaller fraction who are, you know, more concerned with. I mean, you said I was passionate, but that's sort of you know, the setting. Yeah. But I think, you know, scientists, social scientists should most of all, of course, given this value relevance, they should be concerned with describing and explaining things as they are, at the best of their ability. And that sort of more empirical and causal ambition, as it were, is perhaps stronger, at least in my part of the social sciences, than Denmark. But I think Malmö here is maybe an example of a very very empirically grounded and causally grounded type of migration research being done here.
So judging from what you're saying, or adding on to what you're saying, we have of course now talk about quite hard science issues such as labor integration, political participation, and so on. But do you think, as a social scientist, there is normative argument to be made, or a moral argument to be made for an open migration policy, completely regardless of what works, let's say, from this more empirical point of view?
I'm no longer a political philosopher, and wasn't really a political philosopher of that type, of that kind, as it were. But I think you could make such an argument, and I think actually I did write a piece in a Danish paper once on that, and it fell dead to the ground. But
okay.
but you know, it's the philosophers have this. They have. I think it's Singer. He has this thought experiment. So if you walk past a pond and there's a child drowning in the water, should you save this child if you could do so without any danger to yourself? You get your clothes wet. You may be late for work. You may even be late for your own wedding. I mean, you can make the experiment in various ways. But should you save this child? And of course, the answer is yes, unless maybe that if you risk drowning. I mean, you wouldn't say that. You would say that it's a very good deed to try to, but you would say that you shouldn't do so. Is refugees the same? I don't know. I mean, you could also say, that's another way to look at it. It's this luck egalitarian argument. It's for political philosophers. They say it's basically the argument that you can find in John Rawls and others, that people don't deserve their circumstances. You don't deserve whether you are very smart, or you have intelligent, or born in a rich family. You also don't deserve to be born in a specific country. So you don't have any moral right, as it were, to be privileged. All that said, I think there are other second-order reasons for not just having open borders and so on, because I'm not sure that you could have functioning societies and welfare states if you had. And if you don't have that, I think there's another type of argument to say that, well, civilization, as it were, or good societies spread out from Sweden towards the EU and maybe towards somewhere else, although prospects for that at the moment are not so good.
Well, that brings me nicely to another question, which is zooming out a little bit from the topic. I read an article, a published article that you wrote a while ago, and you there wrote that on Danish-Swedish migration, saying that politicians and publics view the other's policies and discourse with increasing hostility. So my question is, do you believe that this difference in migration policy between Sweden and Denmark ultimately can lead to deteriorating Swedish-Danish relationships more generally? I'm thinking perhaps most recently about the 2015 border closure, or the introduction of border checks.
I think it can. I think it can. Not like China and the United States or something like that, but I think it can. And I think I don't quite recall the number. I think there has been instances of, there was one candidate for a post that some international post that Danes wanted to place, and there was actually some profile that under normal circumstances the Swedes would also. I mean, there would usually be this Nordic neighbor help type of thing, and I don't think that's completely to be taken for granted. I think, and I think it's important that somehow that the two countries' politicians somehow, bury the hatchet and think, well, there are points of differences. And although, of course, I've been painting a very stark, you could say, unpatriotic picture of Denmark, but there's a lot of stuff going on out there in local councils and so on, where also in terms of labor market integration and so on, where I think Swedes can also learn from Denmark. Denmark can certainly learn from Sweden in some respects, and we should remember that different approaches, but most of the values are really the same. I mean, it's a mistake, and I think I would warn against that, to think that somehow the Danes are racist or so on. If you look at Eurobarometer and other comparative research into levels of tolerance. For instance, Denmark is up here, while Sweden is even higher. But it's not as if we are so different. But there are some big difference in the approaches. And I think it's important that we keep talking to each other and don't paint these too negative stereotypes, although maybe I have been contributing to that today.
Then I would like to ask you, right at the end of your talk, you were saying that Sweden should not look to Denmark for solutions, although we should be aware of certain problems and issues that will most likely arise in the future. If we don't look to Denmark, do you have any idea of where we should look for solutions to some of these issues that you brought up?
So I think in some areas you might actually want to look to Denmark. Yeah. So I think Sweden probably you've been too late at facing problems of local segregation. Yeah. So it's the wrong solution in Denmark. Ghetto packages and so on. But the idea, I mean, it's certainly the case that having many people arriving and staying in the same place is. I mean, of course, there are certain benefits from it, but there are also big problems. For a long time, also the Swedish settlement policy was extremely different from and basically voluntaristic, and you have strains of that yet. But in Denmark, we actually place refugees, and it comes with a punishment. If you move, you lose your benefit. If you move within the first 3 years, and that can sound draconic, but it probably has had an integration effect. If the placement is well thought out, and sometimes it is, sometimes it hasn't been, but you shouldn't move just one family out to in the middle of nowhere, but a group of families to one specific area, and that works. But really, that's you've also been moving in that direction. Also, I mean, many towns up there in Norrland where you get groups of refugees, and integration is actually proceeding quite well. But I think there are things that you can do, and of course there's this thing about the debate. Is it good? I mean, it is the case that in Sweden there's little bit more sort of there's a lot more whatever you call political correctness and so on. Is it also the case? And I think that's a good thing. But is it a good thing not to talk about things? When I wrote this op-ed, and I think in this small forum, I wrote this op-ed. You asked me to write this op-ed in Aftenposten. Certain things were taken out because, well, it's not really necessary to say that. Not because it offends someone, but because Swedes know that already. So that's a different way to put it. Yeah, that's a different way to put it. You don't have to say that. It's not as if no one's saying it. It's just that you don't have to say it all the time. I think it's very, very important in a public debate to be able to discuss concrete issues without stereotyping, without stupid nationalism and so on, but be able to speak about concrete questions without being called something ugly. But of course, many of those people who want to speak about concrete issues also have political agendas as they do so. I think it's disheartening sometimes as a social scientist when you want to be very concise and saying there's this and there's that and this may cause that, and then to be accused of having an agenda that you don't have. There are certain issues, for instance, issues with levels of crime and so on, that are associated with specific groups and subgroups within groups, and you can look at that from statistics, and I think Swedes and Danish statisticians will agree about that. And you should be able to talk about that without somehow making this a problem about multiculturalism or foreigners or refugees in general or so on. I think that's very important.
Thank you very much, Johan. Is there any in the audience who have a question for Per or Johan? I think they can both English, Swedish and Danish. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for a great talk. I don't know if I should do it in all 3 languages, but this might be kind of a borderline question, but coming from an immigrant, so I ask you just to bear with me. I think there are 2 issues. One is that, especially in Sweden, we have a lot of taboos concerning this topic. And on a global scale, our scope is, in my opinion, way too narrow. Way too narrow. Like, when we have refugees coming knocking on our door, we have this defensive position, and we can't take any progressive steps. And just to play a little with the numbers, because you're a numbers guy, obviously.
No, I'm not actually.
Back in the day, I ran an NGO demining operation in Afghanistan.
Mm.
And we were funded by both the Danish and the Swedish government. And we had 105 Afghans employed. And why that number? That's because that's what we could afford when these two countries funded us. If we take 2015 and the cost for the immigration, and took that's about $1 million per immigrant or refugee. Mm. We would, in Afghanistan, have been able to employ the entire country, from infants to old people. Yeah. And then we could have moved on to Syria and done the same thing. So my question is, why don't we want to help people before they're in trouble? Because we have the funding for it, obviously, but we don't want to. Thank you.
I don't know. My guess is as good as yours, but I don't know. Why is it that we don't, when there are conflicts arising or in connection with the military solution or attempt to make solutions for military conflicts, don't really spend a huge amount of money on rebuilding? And we should be talking huge Marshall help level and higher on rebuilding these countries, and just as we should have targeted help in those areas where we know refugees will be coming from, not necessarily from wars, but from climate changes and floods and so on. We can predict, well, not in detail, but it's possible to predict where some of these flows will be coming from, and this should cause huge investments. I think it's political. I mean, it's you can mobilize political opinion, in favor of wars, but not in favor of the other thing. Although, what may be economically rational, also in a sort of a humanistic perspective, is not necessarily politically rational. But you're making a very, very good point, and also in terms of, I would say, I made that point in terms of accepting refugees, or even, Sweden can't accept all the refugees in the world, but you accepted quite a few, and if the other countries had accepted as many, it would have been a fair amount. And Sweden is not going to disappear as a country because of this. No, it's going to be a challenge. There'll be some problems. There are some problems. There's also an economic boost and a short-term boost. Unfortunately, you're not in a recession, because it will be an even better boost. So you'll get by. Yeah, you might be able to spend some of the money for something else, but it's not. It's not a big thing. So it's not an economic thing. It's a legitimacy thing. It's a political thing, and you can't avoid that. So it's not just people afraid about financing the welfare state. There's also this cultural thing. Some people are more. Most of us who sit here, we like diversity. We like London is more interesting than I don't know, some other countries in the world, just as Stockholm or Malmö are nice and diverse cities, and Copenhagen is becoming one as well. Others don't.
Yes, anyone else?
Hi, thanks for the lecture. I'm a student here at the university. In Sweden, on the political scene, I think we see a balancing, growing left party, balancing the growing right. Do you also see that in Denmark? And do you think that is a good or bad solution to the right wing? As in, solution, would they ever talk to each other? Do they affect each other? Or are they just growing radical powers that have nothing to do with each other?
So in Denmark, you have a strengthened left wing, but there are two parties. So we have the Socialist People's Party, which is actually in some ways mimicking the Social Democrats. So not going as far, but it's not entirely. That's the scale of it. It's not entirely impossible to imagine that the Socialist People's Party would support a social democratic Danish People's Party government. So, I mean, and they're also sort of tough on integration, although they are more liberal in terms of citizenship and other things. I mean, it's not comparable, but they've been taking steps. But then we have a more far-wing left, except that they're not so far-wing. I mean, they're closer to what the Social Democrats used to be 25 or 30 years ago, in a sense. But they are ideologically further away, and they've been growing too. So both of these parties have been growing. Is that a good thing? I don't think it's a good thing, but that's because not speaking as a social scientist. Yeah, I'm a social democrat. The Social Democratic Party are not social democrats in Denmark, but they still are somehow in Sweden. And I think solutions to big societal problems have to come at the center. If you look at the Swedish elections, and also compared to other elections in Europe, what's the really remarkable thing is not, that the Sweden Democrats went up a bit. Actually, they didn't get as many votes as many people thought and some people hoped. The big thing was the splintered picture. So the fact that most mainstream parties in Europe, and now also in Sweden, although Sweden is actually less that, but most mainstream parties, conservative, liberal, social democrats, are small and smaller. So few scored more than 20%. So actually the social democrats in Sweden are still, comparatively speaking, doing quite well. But this tendency for the traditional society-carrying parties, and here I include the Christian Democrats and liberal parties of Europe, becoming smaller and smaller and having to compete with either single issue or ideologically far out parties, either on one side or the other. That's not good. That's not good for Europe and for also not good for Scandinavian welfare states.
Thank you for an interesting talk. I was wondering if you could comment on this idea of post-truth paradigm.
So what
the post-truth paradigm? It seems
the post-truth paradigm.
If you as a researchers contribute with knowledge about migration, how do you see we can solve the problem with some people only picking the raisins out of the cake to support their view on migration? How can we build bridges that counter the polarization?
That's really, really difficult, because nowadays you even have intelligent public intellectuals, who are very anti-immigration and with academic degrees or a social science background, who will take issue with all sorts of things, all sorts of interpretations of statistics with me, and do so in a very intelligent way. Where what's really the case is the glass half full or half empty, and seeing something which I would say, well, this may be a problem, but it's not a disaster. It's a challenge. Seeing that, as it were, as the Untergang des Abendlandes, as the Germans call it, something really sort of really catastrophic, and below that, of course, you have a lot of really post-truth, fake news, so on development. I think education. I think we need to educate our young. I think it's important to have dialogue. So I think it's important to have to see your opponent in the eye, and not just have these contests of statistics on Facebook, but somehow have venues and have occasions, such as this one, for instance, where you see the other in the eye. No one here has really been disagreeing about a lot, so it's not that this type of occasion, but some other type of occasion where you see each other in the eye, and you can see when someone actually means that the opponent means what they say. Because if there's that trust established, I think it's sometimes a little bit more easy to also to come to agree about a certain factual things. But education is really important, and those countries where this is the biggest problem, also the countries that have the biggest problem with education, I think.
Yeah, the time is up. Thank you very much, Per and Johan. Give them a warm hand.
Thank you.